The Ikea Bekant table desk. This is used in a lot of internet IT-based businesses. Really convenient for a lot of people because there's an electric raising and lowering mechanism in these things that self-levels, which is kind of nice. Assembly time on this, I generally would bid this out at 2 guys 1 hour. It is possible for one guy to do this alone, but if you fumble anything, you could damage it, and we want to avoid that type of thing. So if you're doing a whole bunch of these at a fast clip, it does speed up a little bit. If you have somebody staging things, you need to understand each one of these is 3 packages, and then of course there's the tools involved. So I'm going to use a small capacity impact driver with the bit here. I believe this one's a 5 millimeter. Let's see here, 6 millimeter. Okay, so it's a 6 millimeter. They do come with an Allen wrench. It's not a whole lot slower to use the Allen wrench, but I like to use the impact on these things to kind of torque them in there nice and stiff. There's no lock washers on these, so it's just the torque you do on the threads, that's it. 3 boxes. 1 box pretty obviously is going to be your top. You'll want to inspect that for damage. Then you've got your number 1 and your number 2 box. So the top I don't think is really labeled as your number 3. One of the things that can be a little off, it's not like you got a folding tabletop here. You're going to have a separate box for the top. So your number 1 box is going to have a lot of your long structure stuff in it, and the little net for holding up the electrical components. And then you've got the number 2 box, your instructions and your electrical components, and the main legs are going to be in your number 2 box. As you unpack them, if you separate the plastic as you unpack everything, just be really careful about setting the pieces on anything that is something that could be scratched. So I like to lay out the cardboard from another one and work on these things upside down with these pieces laid out on another piece of cardboard so that we don't run the risk of scratching stuff. We'll go through the assembly process as I get this unpacked. The other smart thing to do is separate the cardboard from the plastic, because you're likely going to be dealing with a recycle situation for the cardboard and trash for the plastic. All right, so we're unpacked, doing initial assembly. I like to separate this out just as you see it here. The electronic package is 4 components, and then we've got the legs with the electric motors. That's all built in. You won't do any further assembly on the inside of those. Basically, we attach those to the cross beams for reinforcement, and then we put the brackets together on the tabletop as it's upside down, and then we'll be attaching the feet. Now, in the original factory instructions, they want all of the leg assembly put together as a unit before we do that. It makes it a little heavier, more awkward, and sometimes it won't slip into place on these things as they get oriented in position. So we're going to show that in a few minutes. You'll see it within 10 seconds or 30 seconds. When we're putting this together, we're using the shorter of these 6 millimeter bolts. Notice there's no lock washers, so I like to put a little torque on there to make those lock in place. There's no rubber grommets, no lock washers in there. On these, there's a big end and a little end. You'll see that's the little end, that's the big end. We put it in so that the big end is the one that we can pass our stuff through, right? There's pre-threaded holes in these. You'll see those pre-threaded holes. So it goes through the big end, goes through the little end, goes into the pre-threaded hole. If it cross-threads or something and you force it in, you realize it's a one-way trip. Not that bad. The electrical connectors face inward on these. You can get it wrong if you have those electrical connectors facing outward. So look at the orientation on this. Doesn't really matter which side the label goes on. Both of these things are electrically identical. So you can see the layout, see what we're dealing with. We've got a little hardware box that came in I think the number 1 package. And not a lot of hardware involved. So fortunately it's plug and play for the most part. And that's that sub-assembly all ready to go for its next stage. So you want that nice and tight so there's no wiggle on these things. There is wiggle on this, but these things are going to be tight, torqued down. That's your main support for the whole table. Over here, we've got a cross beam, which This is the orientation of it. You'll center it, and you're going to notice that it has extra holes. The reason is because this hardware set's used with more than one design of table, has the same leg hardware set. So look at the orientation of these holes in relation to everything else, because that's the orientation of it, even though there's holes in what would be wrong places for this. Right now, we're just going to be putting these little plugs in the outer set. Let's see if we can get that thing to focus for us. And so we're just putting those in the outer set. It's a little two-piece thing. So we stick that in there, and then we've got a little pin piece. That little pin piece goes in. We press that in, and what that does is it spreads the little feet on there and locks that in place. Now we're going to be putting more in later. On one side of this, and I want you to be aware of the orientation, because this is another one where it can go wrong. I'm going to put one in here, and this could go in perfectly well backwards and end up wrong. So we're sticking that in so that the orientation is like this. You notice that the L shape with these on the outside. I'm not putting those reinforcements in yet, because we may need to wiggle this around as we get it in position, and I'll show you why. This one, when we want to set this over, I just want to make sure that it's beyond those holes when I set that over. For when I put the other pieces on, we're going to get these out of the way so that they don't bump into our other hardware, because when that gets set in here, it goes across these tracks, bumps up against that one. This one we're going to put in later. Now, according to the instructions, they want you to put all these in place and then put this in there. The issue is that it may not want to go in straight. You could end up forcing it and ginking something, and so we're going to avoid ginking anything by doing it in this method. The other thing is it's a little easier to lift and maneuver this without those other legs attached, especially if it's upside down at tabletop level. And if you want to be really careful, this would be a two-man job. So I set this on here. At my strength level, I can do this alone because I'm a stronger than average person. I set this over here, and I have to maneuver it a little bit in order to get these bolt holes to line up. So as I get those to line up, I want to make sure they're lined up and it turns freely before I try to tighten anything down. Then I'm going to get the machine. Notice I have not put anything on this side yet. I want that side tightened down before I put this together. That side all tightened down. You can see I tightened all of that down. I'm setting these and I'm making sure they line up. So we'll set that. Notice our holes are not quite naturally aligned, so we'll force the alignment by putting our little thingies in here. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is together. This will spread that out. And what's going to happen is I'm going to give these all a little gentle love tap with a rubber mallet to gink everything down. And that avoids the idea of having to force anything over this lip. Next, we'll be putting the feet on. I can show you how that looks. These just set right up on here, just like that. We'll set that up there. We use the longer of the screws on that. Let's get it focused here. We set those on. We gently set that before tightening those down. Okay, so we're going to set those before we tighten them down. We're going to need to set them both because we don't want to tighten one down and then find out the other one was misaligned. Okay, so with those on there, again, they're both kind of hand tightened a little bit before we crank them down. Now you're going to have a little movement here, but that's because these things move in their telescoping track. As far as the attachment between this thing with its threaded holes and this thing, that's solid. Okay, so we tighten that down. When we put the feet on, you notice that these are adjustable for height. I run them down all the way, and then if the table wobbles or something, you can back them off. Okay, so that's how I'm going to do it. If you're doing the assembly, just run them down all the way. We're going to level the rest of that out after the table's in its position. So that's mechanically how that goes. It's a little out of sequence because I'm showing you two at once. Now we're going to do the electrical connection, and that usually be about one of the last things you're going to do, apart from the net that goes on here. But at this stage, make sure everything's tight. Make sure you've taken a rubber mallet to all your little connector things. Just a little love tap, make sure they're down all the way. And then we're going to make the electrical connection. Relatively simple. We've got an interface cord. Doesn't really matter what plug you put it into. They only fit one way, and there's only so many plugs. So you plug it in over there. You run it over underneath this. We plug it in over here, and you'll see a little square that's supposed to work with that tab. And so there's really only one way that's going to go in all the way. Then we're going to plug this in. That's for our power converter. These are actually DC motors in here. That's going to plug in there. I'm going to plug this one in over here. Now, once that feeds DC power to the system, it really doesn't matter which one's plugged in which way. And generally speaking, at Ikea, they want to orient this closer to one side than the other. There's only 2 regular wood screws in this whole kit, and they're pretty close in length. If you look at these things, and you look at that, you notice that if you got one of these wrong, where it wasn't like up on that lip or crushed through that lip. So what this is going to do is it's going to go at the back of this. Sorry about that. It's going to go back and at an angle. So we'll get those 2 screwed in. Last and least, we have the net. So we've got a couple of these things that are a little tall. They're basically going to help hold on to that. You just put it through the loop. You've got a slightly longer version of these plugs. Hammer that in. We've got these. They're going to pin under there. It's going to be a little more difficult because it sticks out a little bit. But once you hammer that in, they go. And you'll end up with an arrangement like this. Next thing we'll do is we'll flip it over, test the motor. Another thing that gets common is undoing part of this and putting a power strip under there. Personal preference. The other thing I've done is zip tied a power strip to the bottom. You can force zip ties through the little holes in that mesh and put a power strip on there, and wrangle other cords for computers and stuff that would be on top of the table. So with everything together, you should have no parts left over, and you shouldn't be missing anything. So one of the things to also understand is you don't really want to test this while it's upside down. You want the weight to be on there evenly, and with it plugged in, we're going to raise it. You'll hear more noise from the motors raising than lowering. But it is power up, power down, kind of like a higher end vehicle winch. And the 2 motors should raise and lower simultaneously. So there's no other adjustment for that. Don't try raising and lowering with the motors, something not plugged in on the other side. But the way these are made, the way the plugs are arranged, it won't work at all if any single plug is unplugged. So double check those if it's not working. You would have to undo your net, double check all your plugs, and because if any single plug isn't working, it's not going to run up and down. But I've never seen a fault on one of these. They seem to always work once they're put together. Anyway, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comment section below.